Welcome everybody to the Econ Playground. I've got some very special guests today. I've got Dr. Daniel Klein, who's a professor of mine at George Mason University, and my friend Al Shami as well, who's in the PhD program with me. We're both first years. And we've had the privilege of having Dr. Klein's classes over the past few years as undergrads and in the future as grad students, where we've studied a lot of things that are loosely in the ballpark of economics, but really it's more the philosophy and work of people like Adam Smith and other people in the Scottish Enlightenment. So we're really grateful to Dr. Klein for all the things he's taught us over the years. But he's here to teach us today about a paper that he wrote a few years ago, and he's been doing some work on recently on the is-ought distinction, or sometimes called the positive normative distinction in economics. So he's got a presentation that he's going to share with us first, and then we're going to have a discussion afterwards. So you can take it away, Dr. Klein.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a great privilege having you guys, well, being with you guys and having you guys as students as you've been. It's extremely rewarding to have outstanding students like you two guys. So I'm really grateful. I want you to know. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation. Ought as an is, I'm going to go through some ideas and some presentations. I don't know, 15, 20 minutes. We'll see. I know you guys are kind of acquainted with this stuff, so I'll just move kind of fast. I just want to see, yeah, here we go. So ought actually comes from O. Past tense of O. It, in fact, even as late as 1825, people in East Anglia were saying he ought me 10 pounds. It's and so ought now is, they say, an auxiliary verb expressing duty or moral obligation, that is owing. The past subjunctive. It's noteworthy that Smith, when he gives an example, says, I owe a man 10 pounds, what I ought to perform, how much I ought to perform, when and where I ought to perform it, the whole nature is prescribed. So he actually connects ought and owe in this particular passage. Now, you might say, well, it's clear that you owe the guy 10 pounds and therefore you ought to pay the guy 10 pounds. You might ask, though, why ought I? What's the justification for that? You could kind of step behind it and say, well, I ought to fulfill my duties of that kind. And then you might say, okay, if I want to think of that ought, that deeper ought of fulfilling these kinds of duties in general, or agreements or contracts, who do you owe there? Who do you owe that behavior to, that more general ought? And that gets us into vaguer ideas of who is owed with these oughts. And it could be, oh, my deeper self, my friends and family, my community, my country, humankind, God. I don't know, it could be any of these, but God's a good and important one because we have the idea of a universal God, that is to say, a God that's sort of universal to humankind. So God is a natural point to focus on, or a term to focus on. So this kind of brings us to God and the idea that God is good because good is God. So a little bit more in terms of word origins. I think that God and good do come from each other or co-evolved. You can see here the very strong connection between good and God in the Nordic German languages, and of course Nordic languages heavily influenced English with the Danes and their Danegeld. In fact, good is G-O-D in most of these, and God is good. So you can just see and hear how much, but the idea that God represents the good of the community is traditional idea of the evolution of religion, the anthropology of religion, if you look at Emile Durkheim, for example. So you can kind of think that God is who you owe your oughts to. If you don't believe in God, if you don't think of yourself as a theist, that's fine. So you've got some other allegorical being. You've got humankind. You've got the sage. You've got the virtuous person or onlooker, whatever. That's who you owe. You owe it to that part of you that wants to be virtuous, that aspires to be virtuous. So you owe it. Ought is owe. And you ought to tie your shoes, therefore can be thought of as it would be good for the whole if you tied your shoes. Oughts can therefore be translated into the good of the whole, or what would be good for the whole. And this relationship between part and whole is a natural recurring or recursive relationship, just like my pinky is a part of my whole hand, and my hand is a part of my whole limb, and a limb is a part of my whole body, and my whole body is a part of my being, and my being is a part of my family, and my family is part of humankind, and blah, blah, blah. And so you got part and whole, and the idea is that, when we talk about oughts, we generally, but that's not to say that we can't focus on a smaller part of the whole, because what's good for a part, of course, will generally be good for the whole, unless there's some sort of ill effect for other parts, which tying my shoes does not seem to imply. And by the way, I don't want to dwell on should, but should comes from shall, and shall has strong etymological connections to these words like Old Norse and Swedish skola. Now, skola in Swedish means school, like my kid goes to school today. And look at this in Old Norse, skuld, should, okay? And I want to suggest that should can be thought of as schooled, maybe with some helping verbs. You should capitalize the first word of a sentence. You can think of that as you have been schooled to capitalize the first word of a sentence. You should keep your promises. You have been schooled to keep your promises. You should help your neighbor. You have been schooled to help your neighbor. You should be honest with yourself. You have been schooled. And the school here, again, can be very metaphorical. The great school of self-command is what Smith called your social world, your social experience, your social upbringing, the great school of self-command. So school, it can just be, experience in the world, society, social interaction. So we got ought, which I really want to focus on. It really can be thought of as what kind of and should, which, is often associated with ought, schooled, okay? And in this way, you can see that they're not so special or different. In fact, statements without ought can easily be rephrased to include ought. Abilene is in Texas. You ought to believe that Abilene is in Texas. I mean, in some sense, that's implied when someone or a book tells you that Abilene is in Texas. And by the way, Abilene is in Texas, isn't it? I'm not quite sure. Murder is wrong. You ought to believe that murder is wrong. So in a sense, there are oughts in our statements all the time. There's all sorts of moral purpose in our conduct, including our speech and discourse. Statements with ought are also easily rephrased. For example, you ought to honor your mother and your father. Well, you could say, I believe you ought to honor your mother and your father. So the main clause there, I believe, is, a non-ought, or some would say an is statement. The whole would be healthier if you honor your mother and your father. God wants you to honor your mother and your father. Sages want you to honor your mother. So it's easy to rephrase from ought to without ought, or without ought to ought. How about government ought to allow kidney payments? I believe government ought, I spelled that wrong, to allow kidney payments. Or social welfare would be enhanced if government allowed kidney payments. Allowing kidney payments would result in positive net benefits. God wants the government. So again, you can get rid of the ought and just say it another way. And also, there's a great deal of tacit oughts always in our conduct, including our speech and discourse. For example, if someone reports that the trend of trend of joblessness is, he might also be saying we ought not focus so much on what the official unemployment rate is. There's sort of an implicit ought there, just in like the choice of the focus and what's important to focus on. When someone says that black markets or quality reductions are consequences of prohibition, he might also be saying we ought not flatten our analysis down to simply a supply and demand diagram. When someone says that a policy reform will tend to have certain dynamic political consequences or moral consequences, he might be saying what things our account of important consequences ought to include. So when we speak, we kind of give out oughts about what we ought to see as the important things, say. When someone formulates an is statement, he is suggesting how we ought to formulate matters. When someone says that one of the benefits of raising the tax on cigarettes is that it will reduce smoking, he is also saying that we ought to think of such a consequence as a benefit. An is statement is an affirmation of the words used in the sentence. So for example, where Adam Smith says the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, he is in effect also saying that you ought to embrace expressing thinking in terms of the division of labor and the extent of the market. Where he says to remove a man who has committed no misdemeanor from the parish where he chooses to reside is an evident violation of natural liberty and justice, he is in effect also saying that you ought to embrace thinking in terms of natural liberty. So the words we use carry a kind of ought of these words are worth using. So there's an idea associated, some people make a big deal out of trying to distinguish and separate ought statements from statements without ought. They might call them is statements, but I'm actually telling you that ought is an is. So I don't necessarily want to kind of make the distinction between ought and is. Maybe it makes more sense to make the distinction between ought statements and and statements without ought. Anyway, very often this is called positive normative distinction. So let me say a little bit about this. First of all, the distinction is from the 20th century, particularly the post-war period. As you can see here, the whole word normative didn't even exist really before about 1890. Here's Milton Friedman. Positive economics is in principle independent of any particular ethical position or normative judgments. As Keynes says, it deals with what is and not what ought to be. So he kind of offers up a is ought way of distinguishing positive and normative. There's a presupposition here that there is some clear or particular distinction between statements that are ought statements, that are not ought statements, and others which are ought statements. And I dispute that presupposition. I really don't. Like I've been saying, you can easily translate one into the other. There are implicit oughts and is statements. And ought itself is a kind of is statement. It's like, why isn't I owe the guy 10 pounds? Is that not an is statement? I owe God 10 pounds, or I owe God not to murder people. Why is that not an is statement as well? Now, here are some other distinctions one could make. A distinction between rules that are precise and accurate, like grammar, and rules that are loose, vague, and indeterminate, like in aesthetics. This distinction, of course, comes from Adam Smith. You can make a distinction between discourse that is reserved versus outspoken, unassuming, tactful versus strident, overbearing. Maybe this is kind of like the others, but some of these relate to each other. Uncontroversial versus controversial, conventional versus unconventional, centrist or sort of status quo oriented versus some particular agenda that's contrary to that or wants to reform drastically and seems kind of motivated. So these are other distinctions, which I think are fine distinctions and which I use when appropriate. Now, let me just show you a remark by Smith when he was speaking about the encyclopedia. He said, the style of some entries is more declamatory than is proper for a dictionary, in which not only declamation, but any loose composition is more than anywhere out of its place. So today, the reviewer, a modern reviewer with this kind of objection might say, the style of some entries is more normative than is proper. But I don't think that would be an improvement myself. I think declamatory specifies better what exactly what exactly the grounds you are objecting on. You're referring to something more here, like outspoken or declamatory, because these relate to each other, but they're not the exact same thing. They're not perfectly coinciding sets of things. I think normative is really quite vague and is used, this normative positive distinction is often very vague and used kind of mischievously. You might wonder whether the positive normative distinction is about the good of the largest whole. I don't think that is the basis for a workable basis for the distinction. For example, I don't think the people who like to talk positive normative would say that the first statement is particularly normative. The discovery of antibiotics advanced the well-being of humankind. I mean, that's a statement about the good of the largest whole, at least as the largest as far as humankind goes. But it doesn't seem like the kind of thing they would like call normative. And then again, other things they would call normative are not so clearly about the good of the largest whole. For example, workers deserve to be paid a living wage. You can imagine someone calling that a normative statement, but it's not clear that it relates to the good of the largest whole. Although I suppose you could make a case for that in a way where you could make it for almost anything. But anyhow, okay. So this is kind of the point I'm driving at. It's that embracing the positive normative distinction is a choice. It's a choice on your part. And the options are to use it in your active vocabulary. And when I say active vocabulary, I mean the set of words and expressions that you make use of. It's already in your passive vocabulary in the sense that when you hear it, you kind of know what people mean or what they think they mean or what they'll say they mean. So it's already in your passive vocabulary, but the question is, should it be in your active vocabulary? And so you could have it or you could not have it in your active vocabulary. And I myself opt for option 2, which is to say, I do not use the positive normative distinction. So I'd like to give you a little feeling for my attitudes there. And I want to make an analogy in some sort of clone world. We are not clones. Let's say but we're kind of operating in a clone world where there are these clones, and we're each going to be the coach of a soccer team. And one of the clone types, one of the clone series is a player called Norm Paz. Okay, like Norman Paz. And the question is, do you want this guy on your team? Now, your team is like your active vocabulary. Do you want this guy on your team? Now, this guy can do some things. He's not worthless. He's not meaningless. He can defend a little, he can whatever. But when you get right down to, and by the way, when you play other teams, you're going to find that they have a Norm Paz on their team. So you're going to recognize it and you're going to defend against it or, deal with it. So the Norm Paz is out there. You can't kind of obliterate Norm Paz from the whole soccer league because other coaches are including Norm Paz on their roster. But you have to decide whether to include him on yours. And I suggest you shouldn't. I think that you're better off. I can't make a whole big case here, but just to give you the spirit, I think you're better off putting some of these players on your team, being ready to put these guys out on your field. You have a large bench, right? We have rather large active vocabularies. These are fine distinctions, and they often work and clarify what you are actually saying, what distinction you're actually making. They also keep you out of some of that trouble that I think the positive normative distinction is used for. And then, of course, you can sometimes just instead of using some other distinction here, you can just not say the sentence where you were going to use the distinction, where someone might have used the distinction, positive, normative. You can just say it another way where you're not maybe using any such distinction here, but just maybe even refrain from what it is you were going to say. That's what I kind of mean by avoiding some of the trouble that comes with it. And so that's kind of my feeling. This is just something else we might get to. So I'll stop there and see what questions you guys have.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Klein. That was really informative, and I'm sure we have a lot of things we could talk about. One thing that I like, that right at the end when you say it's part of our passive vocabulary, that's kind of what I've been wrestling with, because like at the beginning of last semester, Al-Shami and I had Dr. Williams, Walter Williams, as a professor who unfortunately passed away at the end of the semester. But he starts off the semester giving everybody in the class a bunch of statements. And he says, okay, guys, is this a positive statement or a normative statement? And he has the whole class answer. And so he'll say something like, when prices increase, quantity demand decreases. Is that positive or normative? And everybody goes positive. And then he says something like, the minimum wage increases unemployment. Is that positive or normative? And everyone says, or the proper answer is positive, because we're not saying that unemployment is wrong. We're just saying this is an effect of the minimum wage. But if we say something like the minimum wage improves the lives of workers, we can say that's a normative. So the fact that it's part of our passive vocabulary, we understand what people mean when they say it, is different than whether or not you should use it or that it benefits a conversation. So and Al-Shami has some other points that he wanted to bring up too, but
yeah, for sure. And what's really interesting to me is the way that Dr. Walter Williams used to define the distinction, because he says that what defines a positive statement is whether we can appeal to the facts in order to judge their veracity, right? Mm-hmm. And something that I think is quite important when we talk about facts is to have particular reference points that we can use to judge these statements, right? Because to my way of thinking, and I could be totally wrong, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Dr. Klein, on this. A normative statement is a statement with sufficient stated premises. Is a statement that if you have sufficient stated premises, you have a positive statement. So essentially, instead of using normative positive, we could be using non-focal focal. Because if I share a reference point with another person, when I discuss things and I a shared focal reference point, the statement can be defined as a positive statement. If I talk to someone whom, let's say, agrees with me that the consensus of the scientific community is a legitimate reference point, then I can say, well, gravity pulls things downwards at a rate of 9.8 meters per second. That's a positive statement because the person I'm talking to shares the reference point, which is the consensus of the scientific community. And if someone does not share that reference point, it is not a positive statement in a sense because it's not focal. Like the dominated alternative it is dominated by things, by speaking in terms of focal and non-focal. That's how I view it, because I feel like that's a very good distinction because it emphasizes the points of reference. How would you reply to that, or what would you comment on that?
When you say focal and non-focal, that's a little bit like the precise and accurate. I think it's like the precise and accurate versus loose, vague, and indeterminate. And another way of putting that distinction is that we'll generally agree on the precise and accurate. There won't be that much dissension within the room, whereas the other one would have more. So if you want to say that there's merit in that distinction and that we could call it something else, such as precise and accurate versus loose and vague, I think that's fine. My point of view is that we shouldn't use the terms positive and normative for that. What you said about the great Dr. Williams and how he defined positive, as we could recur to the facts to somehow assess it. Right. I mean, I don't understand why the minimum wage makes people better, or whatever, the reductions in the minimum wage or abolishing the minimum wage or whatever he says. Because after all, these statements presumably don't have to be true. I mean, you can disagree with them. But anyway, so let's say he says that liberalizing the minimum wage makes people better off. I don't understand why facts wouldn't help you assess that. So I don't see why that facts basis would if it's again that, well, gee, people aren't going to come to sufficient consensus. I don't know. I don't think that's going to work through as a useful way of distinguishing positive, normative, and I don't know that it's what people. I don't. If you look at the discourse and where people use positive and normative, I don't know if it's going to map to that very reliably. I
suppose that there were a couple of questions that you had in your paper that you said that you were leaving untreated. Like you said right at the end that you weren't treating the unhappy consequences of positive normative talk, or that you weren't treating why people might be committed to positive normative talk. And I think that's something that we could talk about here, because as to the unhappy consequences, another book that you've recommended to me is work by Wayne Booth, in his work on modern dogma. And the fact-value distinction, or the is-ought distinction, is one of the main culprits to him of sort of modern philosophy. And he uses Bertrand Russell as like a primary example of somebody that puts a hard distinction between facts and values. And I think that the problem that shows up is, and this is similar to what the problem with the way that Walter Williams formulated it was he thinks there's just a set of thing called facts and a set of thing called values, and the positive statements are the ones that their truth comes only out of the facts alone, and someone might try to sneak in a value to make it look like a positive statement, but that would be kind of like muddying up our waters. But what Wayne Booth puts forward as kind of the problem when you do this is you've kind of separated these two things into totally different worlds, and we no longer know how they interact. So the problem with someone like Bertrand Russell is he would say, oh, the universe is all just a bunch of cold, hard facts that we use science and analysis to analyze, and we get the truth about them. And then Oh, and I guess people have values too. That's a different question though. That's a normative question. But then when those values come up, they kind of come in a sense that they're so violent, and we've kind of lost the ability to have conversations about what values are between people. So values end up just being this kind of external force that attacks the whatever people and forces them into certain directions. So when we say, like, someone like Bertrand Russell had values, he had very strong moral convictions, but he didn't know how to connect them in conversations or have ethical discussions between people. And I think that's primarily what's lost.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's Wayne Booth's main point as well, that folks like Bertrand Russell who do that, they forego learning how to improve their judgment and their justifications in that realm, which they're calling values. They sort of, the way they create the dichotomy implies that what goes on in the value space is just a matter of preference or is arbitrary or something like that. The point is, the point of Booth and of Adam Smith is what goes on in a lot of our discourse is loose, vague, and indeterminate, but those are loose, vague, and indeterminate are adjectives that apply to rules, certain rules. They're still rules, right? It's not that they stop being rules. It's just that they're not precise and accurate rules. They're loose, vague, and indeterminate rules. So we have to still learn the ruliness of the rules in our larger judgments, our vaguer judgments, our tougher judgments. And that means exploring each other's arguments and sensibilities and sense of what's important and considerations, things we don't know, and all that good stuff. And so only by being open and welcoming to that broader conversation where we are going to agree less, are we going to improve our thinking there. So yeah, that is one of the other I think big harms of these kinds of distinctions and the kind of a strong demarcation is that they just use normative or values or what have you to just sort of dismiss certain arguments, like they get labeled that way, and therefore that's not to be, beyond the pale, not to be considered. So it's kind of a way of bullying and dismissal. And again, it shuts down your own accountability to what you are actually saying.
I think that's exactly right. And I think building on the point that Marcus just made, I think this is why the distinction between focality and non-focality is really important, because it emphasizes the interpersonal nature of rhetoric. Because what is focal between me and Marcus is fundamentally different than what is focal between me and other people. The reference points that we refer to go back to and to understand what is true and false are kind of different. So let's say Marcus and I share, let's say we're both Christians and Muslims or Muslims, right? And we both look at the interpretation of the Bible or the Quran according to this particular scholar as the legitimate reference point. So it's focal between us. And our interactions, when we discuss these things, we'll discuss these things as facts, referring to reference points that other people may disagree with. And that emphasizes this, to us, these things are givens. To other people, they may not be, but they are as givens to us as science is, the consensus of the scientific community to other people. So that's something that I believe is really important to emphasize. And that's particularly why I see focality. I would think that the focality of reference points is a special distinction, and should be put in place next to declamatory remarks and loose remarks, etc., etc.
Yeah, focal, non-focal. I buy it. I like it. Focality versus lack of focality. And that gets you into the issue of focal to whom? So it gets into the issue of the circle of we, among whom this is better understood, or like you say, the referent points are, because you can break it down as these references say this, and you can go and like look it up and like read it, the text, and it is precise and accurate in that specific sense.
Absolutely.
I think that one of the interesting moves that you make that a lot of people don't recognize, and this is and a lot of scholars who make this isn't original to your papers. Typically, people will bring up something like the is-ought distinction, like from Hume, which you mention in your papers probably not the best way to interpret Hume. So when you say Hume didn't mean this by the is-ought distinction, you mean you ought not to interpret Hume's text as saying this. But usually what people will do, like the Bertrand Russell type, will have the is-ought distinction, and then they'll kind of drop the ought and say, well, actually everything is an is, or I'm really good at the is, and this is what I'm focusing on, and pretty much the only thing we can have agreement on is the is. And the is kind of swamps over everything else. But this a little bit goes in the other direction, where that nobody really intuits that the ought can actually swamp over the is to some extent, or they end up mixing themselves into each other. And I think because people are unwilling to make a certain kind of move, and then I'll bring up my favorite guy who I make a lot of stuff about, is William James, right? And a lot of people will interpret when he says the pragmatic theory of meaning, or the pragmatic theory of truth. I think that there's a statement in his essays that a lot of people overlook, which is that the truth is a subspecies of the good, or a species of the good, meaning that these things in our heads, thoughts, are similar to the things outside of our heads that we manipulate and organize and move around into better patterns. So typically we think of ethics as this stuff that happens outside of our actions, things that we do to the world, whereas thinking is just this thing in our head where truth can happen, but it's not really a value thing. But what James is saying is let that inside world be part of the whole ethical world. So he kind of swamps epistemology up with ethics, and they kind of merge into each other. Whereas what Bertrand Russell tried to do was isolate. If you read his history of philosophy, it's really a history of epistemology and how everyone before him was wrong because they weren't him. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. And I think Smith will, or at that time they would refer to these as like ideal notions. Not ideal as in the highest thing, but as in the realm of ideas, kind of the thinking part of the world is a part of the world.
Yes. This kind of relates to estimative justice in Smith. It's about estimating objects properly, and ideas can be objects. And that's an important, very, very important part of your ethical responsibility, to estimate ideas properly. In other words, what to believe or how strongly to believe something. So it's kind of epistemic justice, if you will, is kind of a subspecies of that estimative justice. It's the species of estimative justice that applies to ideas, if you like, as objects. Absolutely.
I have another idea on our second question, but Al-Shami, do you have something on this if you want to go ahead on this?
No, I think that's a great point. I was wondering if you wanted to transition to the point of positive economics and mainline economics. I had a point on that. Maybe we should.
Yeah, go ahead.
Jump into that. So, in the mainline tradition in general, so like people like, starting from Adam Smith, and people were influenced by Adam Smith, like Hayek, Elinor Ostrom, Doug North, et cetera, when they use the term positive economics, usually they mean it in the Weberian sense, like an if-then statement, right? Like if you do this, then this will happen, right? So I was wondering if you could comment on that, and if you think that the means and way of framing things is useful, and if you have any comments about the way that Weber used the term positive, or the way he thought of like means and statements.
Or the way that Dr. Becky phrases it is something like, oh, in economics we treat the ends as given, the ends are facts, and then the means are the stuff that we debate about. Was this means a good means to get to this end, or something like that? That's what economics is about.
Yeah, I'm not thrilled with, I don't know, some kind of means ends device or distinction to salvage this kind of thing. I think that's like another distinction people act like it's some big demarcation, some profound demarcation that'll sort the world or statements into two different buckets or something. But I don't buy that at all. What is the end in one means end relationship will be the means in the next means end relationship, and so on and so forth. I don't know who is giving these ends, and what about just giving the end of the given end of the whole of the good of the whole of humankind? What advances that? Is that then all about means, and then is that what Becky would say is positive?
Well, I think that the point of it is it's somewhat useful in that if you're going to study any historical period or any event in economics, you've got to kind of put your marker down at some point and say, okay, this is the end. It's kind of, I guess the person that's doing the giving is the person that's writing the paper or something like that. So you say, these people had this goal and they did this to go about doing it. Was it successful? Should they have done something else? If we look at all the people trying to get this goal, who's successful, which means or not?
Yeah, well, maybe people specify some goal, but I don't even know how, let's say the goal of CAFE is to reduce, or rather to increase fuel efficiency in cars. Okay, so they imposed these restrictions on car design and engine design, and they increased fuel efficiency in cars. So, okay, but was that good for the whole? They made cars more boring and uniform. They made cars less safe. Okay, so you got one stated end, and we can say whether that end was promoted, we hope. But there are other ends, and which end, what are the most important ends? I guess it comes back to the most important things. That's always a big judgment call that as scholars, scientists, human beings, we're responsible for. What are the most important things? What are the most important ends? Different policies might achieve certain target goals, but there could be other more important things that make them failures in the larger sense. I can't really. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've read some of Weber. I've read some of Weber. I'm not quite sure what I think of him on those matters, and I have read him on quite a bit of this. In a way, I think he's grappling and kind of a little bit playing it both ways. By the way, I think we should also note here that one reason people like to talk this way that we're criticizing is that they want to assert a certain authority. Like, I know something about this positive part, and I'm a scientist. I have the authority when we get to these positive things. Like, I have this credential, I published in these journals, it's called Economic Science. So I'm a scientist, and I don't pretend I'm an authority on that value stuff, but I can claim a certain authority on and that's what and that's what we're running here after all, is a science. So let's focus on that where we have the authority, and you try to emulate that authority and look up to me.
I entirely agree. I think that's a great point. I'm thinking about it, and I think that's a great answer. So if I try to steelman your argument, you're saying that because the positive distinction, even when it's the positive economics, even when used by Weber, is sort of atomistic. It's not taking into consideration the greater picture, because when you take one stated ends, yes, something may advance that particular stated end, but it's potentially disregarding many other factors which require some sort of what they would call normative economics to advance. So it's in the big picture, limiting things to positive economics actually does not advance human well-being. Would that be somewhat of would that be an accurate,
Well, narrowing things down so you don't look at the total effect, which is Ronald Coase's word, the total effect. Like, yeah, often will especially fail at advancing human well-being because you're not looking at the total effect for human well-being. But my major proposal here is simply to expunge positive normative from your active vocabulary. It's not to kind of figure out what it means or the best way to make the distinction. It's to expunge it from your active vocabulary.
No, totally.
I think another reason that people want to employ some kind of fact value distinction or positive normative distinction is they'll say something like, "Oh, I just want to explain the situation. I'm not trying to recommend anything. I'm just curious. Why did they do something like this?" So with this, I'm thinking of work by people like Dr. Leeson, who I like a lot of his work. I think it's interesting economics, but his style is to talk about really strange things in history, like pirates or human sacrifice or things like that, and try to use economic analysis to study them. And so this, I'm not trying to read into motivations or something like that, but you don't want to be caught in a place where you say, oh, pirates intimidating other people was efficient for them because it was advertisement for how violent they could be and how people should not, you shouldn't mess with pirates, right? So it's efficient for them, or it's a good idea from a pirate's perspective, somebody that as a given wants to do this other, terrible thing. So you don't want to be caught in a position where someone says, oh, you're saying that pirates are efficient, or you're saying that pirates were a good thing. And so what, are you promoting these other terrible things? He has a paper on child brides and showing how the reason that they have institutions like that in some other countries is because it's efficient for them at the time. They don't actually marry the children at that age. They just betroth them at a young age, and it's efficient to do that earlier. So you don't want to be caught in a position where someone says, oh, you think that this dastardly, terrible thing is actually efficient or something like that. So we escape the word efficient to not being a value thing, just being a positive kind of an analysis tool rather than any kind of ethical statement at all. So you kind of wipe your hands clean of the situation.
Yeah, by confining it to, I guess you could say, the satisfaction of certain people's certain preferences, you really kind of shrink the whole significance of the topic. And by not speaking to, the horrific nature of these things, like why don't you, right? And again, I think it's partly because some of the people who play up these kind of dichotomies feel uncomfortable, maybe incompetent in doing so. And whatever their reluctance is to speak to bigger issues and to just express sentiment, it's not as though they set the tone. I mean, other people are going to express sentiment very readily and willingly. And it's important for us, that it be better rather than worse, the sentiments and the expressions. So by kind of shrinking from being declamatory or being controversial or being unconventional or being outspoken, you're kind of in a way ceding the field, right? Let me just make one thing before I forget. I just want to say it's not as though I'm like opposing. I just want to make clear to the listeners, I know you guys know this, simple distinctions like ends and means and such, but they're contextual in a contextualized situation. It's not such distinctions have bearing in some focal, to use Al-Shami's term, discussion context. That kind of distinction, like ends versus mean, doesn't work as some kind of profound universe-wide demarcation that separates things in the world or in the world of discourse. So I'm not against some of these simple distinctions, but we shouldn't think that they can do the things that some of these philosophers of science say or suggest they can.
I really like the way that Deirdre McCloskey frames these terms, particularly in the Bourgeois Virtues, this book. And the way that she kind of talks about economists is she puts them in one of the ethical categories, because she uses the Aquinas virtue ethics term. So she says something like, economists are people who study the virtue of prudence. And she's an economist, she really likes economics, so that's not a put down at all. But what she pushes forward, and she says, is one of the biggest lessons in virtue ethics is that you've got to balance yourself between all the different virtues. So you can have prudence, but you also have to be just and have courage and balance yourself with the other virtues. So, like in the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith says, if you look at a pirate, to bring up pirates again, if you look at a pirate, these people are really courageous. You can admire the bravery of a pirate. He's still a bad guy, but you can admire that virtue in him. So since economists are I think sometimes you can fall, being a prudence-only person would be in ethics closer to what we'd call a utilitarian or something like that. And I think it's no surprise that a lot of economists would identify as utilitarians or use that framework for ethics. So if you recommend something as good economic policy, you're kind of recommending it as good ethically if you've already limited your ethical framework to specific economic consequences of an action.
I can see how that would follow. I think, by the way, that it's the self-command that Adam Smith really acknowledged in the Pirates. I mean, courage too, I suppose, but he talked about the Buccaneers as instances of the dazzling self-command, but to ill effect. And we need to really assess someone. We need to see what their self-command is being put toward, right? Or how it's being used. I'm a little reluctant to generalize about economists or this way or in that way. But I hear you, Marcus.
Yeah, I actually think it's unfortunate, and Mises makes the same point in a couple of his books, including Theory and History, and he says that, economics, he believes at least, that it's based on rationalism and utilitarianism, which is, at least I don't agree with that, but I do think that's an unfortunate mistake on that Mises made.
Well, we don't have so much time, but I've said that I want to expunge or avoid or exclude the positive normative distinction from my active vocabulary. It so happens that I kind of keep a list of terms that I am favorable of excluding from my active vocabulary, or that I do exclude. And in fact, utilitarian is one of them. So that's another term for another day, perhaps. But
and rational.
Yeah, rational is also on my list. That's right. I don't know. Maybe you can say it's not serving me very well. Just look at, my very limited success, but so be it. I nonetheless stand by and can affirm these exclusions.
No, I do think it's helpful, at least for me. It helps me think about things more clearly.
Yeah, don't just fall into sucking this stuff into your active vocabulary. Like, think critically about what you should admit. And you should think about maybe trying to expel certain things. It's a
Absolutely.
choice.
I've definitely tried to do that for rational. I don't think that's a particularly useful word. On the issue of why people use the term positive, or like they use this distinction, do you think that part of it is because they don't want to seem controversial, and they want to keep the largest amount of audience, that their research reaches so many people? I do think that that's probably something that informs people's decisions, especially in academia, where people feel like they want to have the greatest outreach. And they are concerned that if they engage in any what they call value judgments, or anything that is a non-focal value judgment, that is, that they're going to alienate a certain set of people.
Yeah,
like that's certainly the case. If I were to make, say, a moral judgment that relies on the Jews or atheists, that's not very appealing. So if you could comment on that, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, so they have their projects, their crafts, some, as you might say, a bit sneeringly, sometimes in academia. And maybe they keep it kind of focal, precise and accurate to the model, or to the econometric model, the equilibrium model, the results of the experiment, the statistical significance, and whatever. And doesn't necessarily sound all that earth-shaking, or, much oomph, to use Deirdre's expression. And, they might imagine people saying, so why aren't you talking about something more important? Or why aren't you saying something more provocative, more interesting? They say, well, I'm a scientist. What you want is normative. I'm positive. So I'm just doing my, the proper duty of positive research. By the way, notice how positive also works with this connotation of opposed to negative, kind of like I'm positive, you're the other thing. I don't think that's quite an accident. But yeah, so I think that's right. It goes back to some of those motivations I think we touched on.
Yeah, I don't know if we have any more comments, or if you want to say any final closing statements, Dr. Klein.
No, I don't particularly know that I do. I really appreciate this kind of conversation and interacting with you guys.
Okay, yeah, great. Well, thanks for coming on, Dr. Klein, and thanks for helping me interview Al-Shami, and we'll see everybody later.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. It was our pleasure.
Likewise. Bye, Al-Shami.